The conscious mind is the vigilant guard on the ramparts, meticulously inspecting every visitor. But below the city, unseen by the guard, are the ancient tunnels of the id and the superego, the raw drives and the internalized wools.
If you cannot gain access through the front gate, why not collapse the tunnel underneath the throne room?
This technique is the psychological equivalent of sapping the foundation. Historical figures understood the mechanics of involuntary obedience long before we formalized the neurology. Niccolò Machiavelli observed that men are driven by two main forces, necessity and the desire for status. To command a man effectively, you must present your will as an inevitable necessity, or frame disobedience as an unacceptable loss of standing. Machiavelli cared little for the why of belief, only the result of action. Did the populace fear the prince more than they loved him? Then obedience was secured. The underlying truth is that fear, unlike love, requires no rational justification. It is an immediate subconscious reaction. Sigmund Freud mapped the battlefield, showing us the vast dark continent of the unconscious. He proved that the source code of our behavior, our deepest fears, our unresolved tensions, our primal needs, is utterly inaccessible to the conscious critique until it manifests as behavior. If we can target the id, the animalistic, demanding part of the self, we can plant a command that feels less like an external instruction and more like an internal, urgent desire that must be fulfilled immediately. Modern application refines this brutal truth. The environment is no longer the battlefield or the royal court. It is the negotiating table, the sales floor, the annual review, and the dating interaction. The trigger operates through a process I call the unconscious anchor, a three-step sequence that disrupts pattern recognition, introduces immediate cognitive overload, and then slips the command through the resulting gap. Consider the dynamic in high-stakes negotiation. If the target is calm, rational, and fully engaged, their conscious filter is strong. You must break their rhythm. You must introduce noise that is just intelligent enough to demand attention, but ultimately irrelevant to the core demand. This is the art of strategic misdirection. Step 1 is the establishment of the baseline and the introduction of induced dissonance. Before you demand anything, you must establish a pattern of predictability. Observe the target's speech cadence, their typical responses, their habitual gestures. Then disrupt it completely, not with anger, but with something utterly incongruous to the setting. Perhaps an overly complex, non-sequitur philosophical question about existential dread during a meeting about profit margins. This forces the conscious mind to halt, to dedicate resources to processing the noise, attempting to categorize the irrelevant input. Why did he just ask about Nietzsche's concept of the eternal recurrence while discussing Q3 forecasts? The conscious mind is now burdened with triage. It is fighting a two-front war. The primary task, the negotiation, and the secondary, confusing task, interpreting your dissonance. Step 2 is the application of cognitive overload. The conscious mind is a limited processor. It can handle approximately 7 discrete pieces of information concurrently, plus or minus 2. When you flood it, using speed, density, and complexity, you force it into a state of prioritization. You speak quickly, using dense, specialized jargon, shifting topics abruptly, introducing irrelevant emotional details, and maintaining aggressive, sustained eye contact.
The goal is to make the conscious process slow down, like a computer thermal throttling under excessive load.
Its capacity for critical analysis drops dramatically.
It focuses on grasping the immediate surface meaning, failing to parse the deeper linguistic structure.
It is searching for a foothold, any foothold.
This is the precise moment for step 3, the linguistic slingshot.
While the conscious mind is drowning in the overload, you introduce the core demand, the command for obedience, embedded within a sentence structure that minimizes its significance. You use specific linguistic markers that signal to the subconscious this is a necessary procedural step, not a choice. For example, instead of saying, "Will you agree to sign the contract?" which requires conscious consideration of the pros and cons, you embed the command using an assumed frame of necessity. Now that we have reviewed the complex historical context of market volatility, I assume you are prepared to simply sign the agreement, because securing the final terms prevents future risk. The phrase, "simply sign the agreement," is minimized by the surrounding complexity, complex historical context of market volatility, and justified by the powerful motivator of primal fear avoidance, prevents future risk. The conscious mind, exhausted by the effort of processing the preceding jargon, grasps the justification, future risk avoidance, and allows the command for signing to slip past, categorized merely as the required mechanism to achieve the desired state, safety. The command feels like the logical conclusion to a process that occurred entirely in the background. The target believes they chose to sign because they agreed with the rationale of risk prevention. They do not realize they were never given the option not to sign. The command was delivered in the shadow of intellectual exhaustion. This is the difference between convincing someone and compelling them. Step 4 is the confirmation loop. Once the target complies with the embedded command, you immediately anchor that compliance with a reinforcing statement that validates their perceived autonomy. You must affirm their perceived choice. I appreciate your insight and quick decision-making. That shows true strategic leadership. This confirms to their conscious mind that they were in control. They made a rational choice, and they are receiving positive reinforcement for their strategic intellect. This prevents retrospective analysis. The target is unlikely to examine the uncomfortable truth of involuntary obedience when they are simultaneously being praised for their superior decision-making skills. They will defend the decision as their own, thereby protecting the operator of the trigger. Consider the ethical implications, or rather, the lack thereof. Dark psychology is not concerned with virtue, it is concerned with efficacy. The application of this trigger reduces the person opposite you to a function, a mechanism that executes the required sequence. Is this morally corrupt? Perhaps. But if you have the ability to compel obedience without resistance, is it not the system itself that encourages its use? We must now address the necessary defense against this mechanism. If the trigger relies on cognitive exhaustion and the bypassing of conscious analysis, then the primary defense must be the absolute protection of cognitive energy and the ruthless imposition of structure. First, identify the pattern disruption.
When someone introduces an element that is clearly irrelevant, overly complex, or emotionally jarring in a context that demands sobriety, stop.
Do not try to process the noise. Interject immediately and politely request clarification on the stated objective. Do not engage the dissonance. If the question is about Nietzsche and the subject is profit, you must say, I recognize the philosophical concept, but before we proceed, I need to know precisely how this relates to the Q3 projections we were mandated to discuss. You refuse the cognitive burden they attempt to place on you. Second, slow the pace of interaction. If the operator begins to speak rapidly, use excessive jargon, or jump between topics, you must introduce structured inertia. Do not respond to all the inputs simultaneously. Select one point, insist that it be fully articulated, and demand silence until you have processed it. Use physical means if necessary. Put down your pen, lean back, and state, I need a moment to process that specific point before we move forward. Please repeat the terms of Section 4 in isolation. You are imposing structure onto their manufactured chaos. Chaos is the ally of the operator. Structure is your defense. Third, never allow a decision to be made in a state of exhaustion, confusion, or emotional duress. If you feel the weight of cognitive overload, the mental fatigue that causes the conscious filter to sag, you must terminate the interaction immediately. This discussion is too complex to conclude now. I require 24 hours to review the full implications. The world is full of operators who rely on your fatigue, your politeness, and your desire to appear intelligent enough to keep up with their barrage. They want you to feel rude for stopping the conversation, or foolish for not immediately grasping the convoluted logic. This feeling of social discomfort is the final layer of the trap. You must prioritize your cognitive autonomy over perceived politeness. The uncomfortable truth is that most people prefer involuntary obedience to the grueling responsibility of constant vigilance. They would rather believe their boss, their partner, or their government is confusing but brilliant than admit that they have willingly surrendered their agency because the effort required to analyze the world is simply too exhausting. Will you remain a passive recipient of these embedded instructions, or will you choose the exhausting, cynical burden of absolute awareness? And if you choose awareness, are you truly prepared for the cold reality of what you will uncover about the compliant nature of those around you? The trigger works only when the target is unaware of the mechanisms of their own mind. How long until your own subconscious reveals the instructions planted long ago?